In this video, I'm going to talk you through a source that I have adapted for high school that comes from Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, Chapter 18, The Impossible Victory, Vietnam. This book is a fantastic coverage of the underdog stories that tend to get left out of American history textbooks. And for the moment anyway, it is entirely available online for free at historyisaweapon.com. In the video that I'm about to present, I've taken Zinn's chapter and I have kind of made it so that high schoolers can kind of access the information without really losing any of the complexity. I want to front load this video with like pictures of what you are going to be reading about. One of the things that gets mentioned in this chapter is the Vietnam veterans against the war and the Winter Soldier investigation. The Winter Soldier investigation was videotaped testimony given in Detroit, Michigan in 1971, in which combat veterans from the Vietnam War who had either themselves committed war crimes or who had seen themselves war crimes being committed by the United States came back to testify publicly about what they had seen that they felt was getting left out of the public record. This is an astonishing development. Normally, it doesn't happen that soldiers talk about violence that they themselves have committed to others, especially when they know that it is wrong. And so it's a really interesting peek into the Vietnam War from the eyes of people who were there. At Yes Prep West at our school, we actually were able to interview this guy, Scott Camille, who took part in the Winter Soldier investigation. And if I find that video, I will put it up on YouTube. It's in my archive somewhere. Anyway, the Winter Soldier investigation and all of these transcripts, and you can even find a video of the testimony if you look for it online. It's a great primary source. I encourage you to look for it, with the caution that because these are soldiers talking about war crimes, the content that they discuss is really violent and kind of shocking. Another related fantastic look into what the Vietnam War was actually like comes from testimony that John Kerry gave before the Senate in 1971. John Kerry then had been an officer in the Navy, I believe, and he was really active in organizing these Vietnam veterans against the war. Again, because what they were seeing in Vietnam did not match what was being told to the American public, and they felt that that was important enough to put their reputations on the line to tell the truth. The transcript of Kerry's testimony is incredibly powerful and incredibly articulate, and you can find it on YouTube. Search for it. Please do. Please watch it. The transcript is also available. Google is your friend. Please go find this and read it. It is illuminating. John Kerry, of course, went on to have an illustrious career in public service and, as of this recording date, is still actively involved in politics. You're also going to hear about a number of weapons and war crimes. Napalm, for one thing, you can see on your screens in the pictures on the left and on the bottom. It is a nasty weapon that sticks to the skin as possible to put out and doesn't discriminate in who it hurts. You're also going to hear about the My Lai massacre, which was one of the only, maybe the only war crime that any officer got held to account for on the American side. It was a rare event. Not the war crimes part, those were common, but like the officer who ordered it being hauled into trial, that was rare. Not that he served very much time, but whatever. You'll also hear about the Pentagon Papers, another great hero of the Vietnam War moment, aside from the soldiers who were brave enough to testify about what they saw, were the journalists who uncovered classified information from government documents that didn't match what the public was being told about Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers made a huge difference in public perception of a war at the time, and they make for fantastic reading now. You can find them at archives.gov/research/Pentagon-papers. You're also going to hear about how protesting actually made a difference, not just random protesting in front of a Capitol by random groups of people, but organized protests by the working class, by leaders of the civil rights movement, and by university students who, en masse, were able to shift public opinion and actually bring an end to the war. On the top right of your screen, over here, you can see a picture of the Kent State Massacre, which comes up in the source, and that involved National Guardsmen coming out and actually shooting some university students who were demonstrating against the war. And then finally, I wanted to front load the source with a map. And accompanying the map is a little bit more text from Carrie's statement on the Vietnam War, definitely worth pausing and reading. But just so you can orient yourself, Vietnam is this strip of land right here. It was split along the 17th parallel between the north, which was communist, notice how it borders China, which was also communist, and the south, which was supported by the United States. You'll also hear reference to Indochina. Indochina was the name of the territory including Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia, which then after colonization ended, split into different states, though all of them got wrapped up in this conflict. The following is a selection from Chapter 18, The Impossible Victory, Vietnam, taken from A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and adapted for a high school audience by me. As I read the text for you, follow along. When you see a little text bubble like this, it's good practice to stop and summarize the information that you're receiving in your notes in kind of outline form. And if you need more guided questions or a more guided outline of events, you can find those on the right as I go. From 1964 to 1972, the wealthiest and most powerful nations in the history of the world made a maximum military effort, with everything short of atomic bombs, to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement in a tiny peasant country, and failed. When the United States fought in Vietnam, it was organized modern technology versus organized human beings, and the human beings won. In the course of that war, there developed in the United States the greatest anti-war movement the nation had ever experienced, a movement that played a critical part in bringing the war to an end. First, he's going to go through what happened. For context, Indochina refers to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. And there is a rundown of events off to the right, because I know this is a lot of information. So if that helps you keep track, pause and jot some of this down. In the fall of 1945, Japan, defeated, was forced to leave Indochina, the former French colony it had occupied at the start of the war. In the meantime, a revolutionary movement had grown there, determined to end colonial rule and to achieve a new life for the peasants of Indochina. Led by a communist named Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionists fought against the Japanese, and when they were gone, held a spectacular celebration in Hanoi in late 1945, with 1 million people in the streets, and issued a Declaration of Independence. It borrowed from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from the French Revolution, and from the American Declaration of Independence, and began, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Just as the Americans in 1776 had listed their grievances against the English king, the Vietnamese listed their complaints against French rule. Quote, "They have enforced inhuman laws. They have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots. They have drowned uprisings in rivers of blood. They have fettered public opinion. They have robbed us of our rice fields, our mines, our forests, and our raw materials. They have invented numerous unjustifiable taxes and reduced our people, especially our peasantry, to a state of extreme poverty. From the end of last year to the beginnings of this year, more than 2 million of our fellow citizens died of starvation. The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against any attempt by the French colonialists to reconquer their country." The U.S. Defense Department's study of the Vietnam War, intended to be top secret but released to the public in the famous Pentagon Papers case, described Ho Chi Minh's work. He had built the Viet Minh into the only Vietnam-wide political organization capable of effective resistance to either the Japanese or the French. He was the only Vietnamese wartime leader with a national following,
and he assured himself wider fealty among the Vietnamese people when in August through September 1945 he overthrew the Japanese, established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and staged receptions for incoming Allied occupation forces. For a few weeks in September 1945, Vietnam was, for the first and only time in its modern history, free of foreign domination and united from north to south under Ho Chi Minh. The Western powers were already at work to change this. England occupied the southern part of Indochina and then turned it back to the French. Nationalist China, and this was before the Communist Revolution in China, occupied the northern part of Indochina. And the United States persuaded it to turn that back to the French. As Ho Chi Minh told an American journalist, "We apparently stand quite alone. We shall have to depend on ourselves." Between October 1945 and February 1946, Ho Chi Minh wrote 8 letters to President Truman, American President Truman, reminding him of the self-determination promises of the Atlantic Charter. Remember, self-determination is the right to choose your own government. And the Atlantic Charter was the document that came out of World War II, stating their war aims. One of the letters was sent both to Truman and to the United Nations. Quote, "I wish to invite attention of Your Excellency for strictly humanitarian reasons to the following matter. 2 million Vietnamese died of starvation during winter of 1944 and spring of 1945. Many people are starving. Unless great world powers and international relief organizations bring us immediate assistance, we face imminent catastrophe." As a reminder, the Atlantic Charter was a policy statement issued in 1941 that, early in World War II, defined the Allied goals for the post-war world. No territorial aggrandizement, no territorial changes made against the wishes of the people, restoration of self-government to all those deprived of it, reduction of trade restrictions, global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for all, freedom from fear and want, freedom of the seas, and abandonment of the use of force, disarmament of aggressor nations. So, to recap, here's what happened. Indochina, meaning Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, had been a French colony. During World War II, Japan took it. After World War II, France tried to get it back. Communist Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese revolutionary who fought imperial powers for an independent Vietnam, was the leader of the North. He, in Vietnam, through him, issued the Declaration of Independence, which was modeled after ours. And Vietnam was then united under Ho Chi Minh. Following that, Western powers tried to reoccupy Vietnam from the south to give it back from the France, while nationalist China occupied it from the north, and the United States convinced the North Vietnam to be turned back to the French too. 8 years of war of independence between Vietnam and France then began. Meanwhile, China became communist, the Korean War happens, and the United States decides to give a lot of money to help the French win because they don't want Vietnam to fall into communist hands. The French, however, lose. Vietnam became independent and democratic, with popular support behind Ho Chi Minh. However, the United States then established a sphere of influence in South Vietnam, began to support an unpopular, unelected leader, and then finally will go to war in Vietnam against the North. To Ho Chi Minh's letter to Truman that had reminded the American president about the self-determination promises and the Atlantic Charter, Truman never replied. For the following section, listen for both material and ideological reasons for American involvement in Vietnam. In October 1946, the French bombarded Haiphong, a port in northern Vietnam, and there began the 8-year war between the Viet Minh movement and the French over who would rule Vietnam. After the communist victory in China in 1949 and the Korean War the following year, the United States began giving large amounts of military aid to the French. By 1954, the US had given 300,000 small arms and machine guns, enough to equip the entire French army in Indochina, and $1 billion. Altogether, the US was financing 80% of the French war effort. Why was the United States doing this? To the public, The word was that the United States was helping to stop communism in Asia, but there was not much public discussion. In the secret memoranda of the National Security Council, which advised the president on foreign policy, there was talk in 1950 of what came to be known as the domino theory, that, like a row of dominoes, if one country fell to communism, the next one would do the same, and so on. It was important, therefore, to keep the first one from falling. A secret memo from the National Security Council in June 1952 also pointed to the chain of US military bases along the coast of China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. Quote, communist control of all of Southeast Asia would render the US position in the Pacific offshore island chain precarious and would seriously jeopardize fundamental US security interests in the Far East. And, quote, Southeast Asia, especially Malaya and Indonesia, is the principal world source of natural rubber and tin, and a producer of petroleum and other strategically important commodities or raw materials. It was also noted that Japan depended on the rice of Southeast Asia, and communist victory there would make it extremely difficult to prevent Japan's eventual accommodation to communism. In 1953, a congressional study mission reported, the area of Indochina is immensely wealthy in rice, rubber, coal, and iron ore. Its position makes it a strategic key to the rest of Southeast Asia. That year, a State Department memo said that the French were losing the war in Indochina, had failed, quote, to win a sufficient native support, end quote, feared that a negotiated settlement, quote, would mean the eventual loss to communism, not only of Indochina, but of the whole of Southeast Asia, and concluded, if the French actually decided to withdraw, the US would have to consider most seriously whether to take over in this area. In 1954, the French, having been unable to win Vietnamese popular support, which was overwhelmingly behind Ho Chi Minh and the revolutionary movement, had to withdraw. An international assemblage at the Geneva presided over the peace agreement between the French and the Viet Minh. It was agreed that the French would temporarily withdraw into the southern portion of Vietnam, that the Viet Minh would remain in the north, and that an election would take place in 2 years in a unified Vietnam to enable the Vietnamese to choose their own government, self-determination. The United States moved quickly to prevent the unification and to establish South Vietnam as an American sphere of influence. It set up in Saigon as head of government a former Vietnamese official, Diem, who had recently been living in New Jersey, and encouraged him not to hold the scheduled elections for unification. A memo in early 1954 of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that the intelligence estimates showed a settlement based on free elections would be attended by almost certain loss of the associated states, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the 3 parts of Indochina created by the Geneva Conference, to communist control. In other words, if we let them vote, they're going to vote for the communist. Diem again and again blocked the elections requested by the Viet Minh, and with American money and arms, his government became more and more firmly established. As the Pentagon Papers put it, South Vietnam was essentially the creation of the United States. Based on what we've read so far, can involvement in Vietnam be defended by the desire to quote-unquote spread democracy? Cite evidence in your reasoning. Jot that down in your notes, and then we'll continue. The Diem regime became increasingly unpopular in South Vietnam. Diem was a Catholic, and most Vietnamese were Buddhists. Diem was close to the landlords, and this was a country of peasants. His pretenses at land reform left things basically as they were. He replaced locally selected provincial chiefs with his own men, appointed in Saigon. By 1962, 88% of these provincial chiefs were military men. Diem imprisoned more and more Vietnamese who criticized the regime for corruption, for lack of reform. Opposition grew quickly in the countryside, where Diem's apparatus could not reach well, and around 1958, guerrilla activities began against the regime. The communist regime in Hanoi, North Vietnam, gave aid, encouragement, and sent peoples south to support the guerrilla movement. In 1960, The National Liberation Front was formed in the South. It united the various strands of opposition to the regime. Its strength came from South Vietnamese peasants who saw it as a way of changing their daily lives. Pause and jot down. Why was Diem unpopular, and did he reflect the values of the United States? And then for context, because this gets a little complicated, groups that opposed the regime in South Vietnam, and by extension, United States involvement in Vietnam, included the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, and the National Liberation Front, the NLF. A US government analyst named Douglas Pike, in his book Viet Cong, based on interviews with rebels and captured documents, tried to give a realistic assessment of what the United States faced. Quote, "The communists have brought to the villages of South Vietnam significant social change and have done so largely by means of the communication process. That is, they were organizers much more than they were warriors. What struck me most forcibly about the NLF, the National Liberation Front, was its totality as a social revolution first and a war second. The purpose of this vast organizational effort was to restructure the social order of the village and train the villages to control themselves. Not the killings of ARVN, Saigon soldiers, not the occupation of real estate, not the preparation for some great pitched battle, but organization in depth of the rural population through the instrument of self-control. The Pentagon Papers said of this period, quote, only the Viet Cong had any real support and influence on a broad base in the countryside. When President Kennedy took office in the United States in 1961, he continued the policies of President Truman and Eisenhower in Southeast Asia. Almost immediately, he approved a secret plan for various military actions in Vietnam and Laos, including, quote, the dispatch of agents to North Vietnam to engage in, quote, sabotage and light harassment, according to the Pentagon Papers. Back in 1956, he had spoken of, quote, the amazing success of President Diem instead of Diem's Vietnam. Her political liberty is an inspiration. One day, in June 1963, a Buddhist monk sat down in the public square of Saigon and set himself on fire. Here's a picture. More Buddhist monks began committing suicide by fire to dramatize their opposition to the Diem regime. Diem's police raided the Buddhist pagodas and temples, wounded 30 monks, arrested 1,400 people, and closed down the pagodas. There were demonstrations in the city. The police fired, killing 9 people. Then, in the ancient capital, 10,000 demonstrated in protest. The Geneva Accords were a set of agreements that temporarily separated Vietnam into 2 zones, a northern Vietnam zone governed by the Viet Minh, and a southern zone to be governed by the state of Vietnam, then headed by a former emperor. Under these accords, the Geneva Accords, the United States was permitted to have 685 military advisors in southern Vietnam. Eisenhower secretly sent several thousand. Under Kennedy, the figure rose to 16,000, and some of them began to take part in combat operations. Diem was losing. Most of the South Vietnam countryside was now controlled by local villagers, organized by the NLF, that opposition group. Diem was becoming an embarrassment, an obstacle to effective control over Vietnam. Some Vietnamese generals began plotting to overthrow his regime, and Diem was overthrown by a military coup that the US knew about and didn't warn him about. He fled the palace, but he and his brother were apprehended by the plotters, taken out into a truck, and executed. Earlier in 1963, Kennedy's Undersecretary of State, Hugh Alexis Johnson, was speaking before the Economic Club of Detroit. And he said, "What is the attraction that Southeast Asia has exerted for centuries on the great powers? Why is it desirable, and why is it important? First, it provides a lush climate, fertile soil, rich natural resources, and a relatively sparse population in most areas, and room to expand. The countries of Southeast Asia produce rich exportable surpluses, such as rice, rubber, teak, corn, tin, spices, oil, and many others." This is not the language that was used by President Kennedy in his explanations to the American public. He talked of communism and of freedom. In a news conference, February 14, 1962, he said, "Yes, as you know, the US for more than a decade has been assisting the government, the people of Vietnam, to maintain their independence." So pause here and jot down in your notes, why was Southeast Asia valuable? And why was the war discussed differently in public? 3 weeks after the execution of Diem, Kennedy himself was assassinated, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, took office. In early 1946, President Johnson used a murky set of events in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, to launch a full-scale war on Vietnam. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told the American public that there was an attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on American destroyers. While on routine patrol in international waters, McNamara said, the U.S. destroyer Maddox underwent an unprovoked attack. It later turned out that the Gulf of Tonkin episode was fake, that the highest American officials had lied to the public. In fact, the CIA had engaged in a secret operation attacking North Vietnamese coastal installations, so if there had been an attack, it would not have been unprovoked. It was not a routine patrol because the Maddox was on a special electronic spying mission, and it was not in international waters, but in Vietnamese territorial waters. It turned out that no torpedoes were fired at the Maddox, as McNamara said. Another reported attack on another destroyer 2 nights later, which Johnson called open aggression on the high seas, seems also to have been an invention. The Tonkin quote-unquote attack brought a congressional resolution, passed unanimously in the House, and with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate, gave Johnson the power to take military action as he saw fit in Southeast Asia. The Tonkin Resolution gave the president the power to initiate hostilities without the declaration of war by Congress that the Constitution requires. Pause here and summarize these 2 paragraphs. What happened with the Gulf of Tonkin, and how did it provide an excuse for military intervention by the states? Next section, U.S. involvement officially begins. Immediately after the Tonkin Affair, American warplanes began bombarding North Vietnam. By early 1968, there were more than 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam, and then the U.S. Air Force was dropping bombs at a rate unequaled in history. Tiny glimmerings of the massive human suffering under this bombardment came to the outside world. On June 5, 1965, the New York Times carried a dispatch from Saigon. Quote, "As the communists withdrew, United States jet bombers pounded the hills into which they were headed. Many Vietnamese, one estimate is as high as 500, were killed by the strikes. The American contention is that they were Viet Cong soldiers, but 3 out of 4 patients seeking treatment in a Vietnamese hospital afterwards for burns of napalm or jellied gasoline were village women." Large areas of South Vietnam were declared fire-free zones, which meant that all persons remaining within them, civilians, old people, children, were considered an enemy, and bombs were dropped at will. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were subject to search and destroy missions. Men of military age in the village were killed, and homes were burned, the women, children, and old people sent off to refugee camps. The CIA in Vietnam, in a program called Operation Phoenix, secretly, without trial, executed at least 20,000 civilians in southern Vietnam, who were suspected of being members of the communist underground. By the end of the Vietnam War, 7 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Vietnam, more than twice the total bombs dropped on Europe and Asia in World War II. Almost 1 500-pound bomb for every human being in Vietnam. In addition, poisonous sprays were dropped by planes to destroy trees and any kind of growth. An area the size of the state of Massachusetts was covered with such poison. Vietnamese mothers reported birth defects in their children. Pause here and note the military tactics that were used in this part of the operation. On March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers went into the hamlet of My Lai. They rounded up the inhabitants, including old people and women with infants in their arms. These people were ordered into a ditch where they were methodically shot to death by American soldiers. The testimony of James Dursey, a rifleman, at the later trial of Lieutenant William Calley was reported in the New York Times. Lieutenant Calley and a weeping rifleman named Paul D. Medlow, the same soldier who had fed candy to the children before shooting them, pushed the prisoners into the ditch. There was an order to shoot by Lieutenant Calley. It was something like, "Start firing." Medlow turned to me and said, "Shoot, why don't you shoot?" I was crying. I said, "I can't, I won't." Then Lieutenant Calley and Medlow pointed their rifles into the ditch and fired. Journalist Seymour Hersh, in his book My Lai, writes, when American investigators reached the Barren area in November 1969, in connection with the My Lai probe in the United States, they found mass graves at 3 sites, as well as a ditch full of bodies. It was estimated that between 450 and 500 people, most of them women, children, and old men, had been slain and buried there. Several of the officers in the My Lai massacre were put on trial, but only Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but his sentence was reduced twice. He served 3 years. Nixon ordered that he be under house arrest rather than a regular prison, and then he was paroled. Thousands of Americans came to his defense. Part of it was in patriotic justification of his action as necessary against the communists. Part of it seems to have been a feeling that he was unjustly singled out in a war with many similar atrocities. The more unpopular became the Saigon government, the more desperate the military effort became to make up for this. The massacre at My Lai by a company of ordinary soldiers was a small event compared with the plans of high-level military and civilian leaders to visit massive destruction on the civilian population of Vietnam. Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton in early 1906, seeing that a large-scale bombing of North Vietnam villages was not producing the desired results, suggested a different strategy. The airstrikes on villages, he said, would create a counterproductive wave of revulsion abroad and at home. He suggested instead, destruction of locks and dams, however, if handled right, might offer promise. Such destruction doesn't kill or drown people. By shallow flooding the rice, it leads after a time to widespread starvation. More than 1 million? Unless food is provided, which we could offer to do at the conference table. In other words, he proposed to destroy their food supply in a way that was slow and not directly traceable to American actions, and then to provide people food to get them support. The heavy bombings were intended to destroy the will of ordinary Vietnamese to resist, as in the bombings of German and Japanese population centers in World War II, despite President Johnson's public insistence that only military targets were being bombed. Meanwhile, just across the border of Vietnam, in a neighboring country, Laos, where a right-wing government installed by the CIA faced a rebellion, one of the most beautiful areas in the world, the Plain of Jars, was being destroyed by bombing. By early 1968, the cruelty of the war began touching the conscience of many Americans. For many others, the problem was that the United States was unable to win the war. While 40,000 American soldiers were dead by this time, 250,000 wounded, with no end in sight. The Vietnamese casualties were many times this number. Lyndon Johnson had escalated a brutal war and failed to win it. His popularity was at an all-time low. He could not appear publicly without a demonstration against him in the war. In the spring of 1968, Johnson announced he would no longer run for president, and the negotiations for peace would begin with the Vietnamese in Paris. In the fall of 1968, Richard Nixon, pledging that he would get the United States out of Vietnam, was elected president. He began to withdraw troops. By February 1972, less than 150,000 were left. But the bombing continued. Nixon's policy was Vietnamization. The Saigon government, with Vietnamese ground troops using American money and air power, would carry on the war. Nixon was not ending the war. He was ending the most unpopular aspect of it, the involvement of American soldiers on the soil of a faraway country. In the spring of 1970, Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger launched an invasion of Cambodia after a long bombardment that the government never disclosed to the public. The invasion not only led to an outcry of protest in the United States, it was a military failure, and Congress resolved that Nixon could not use American troops in extending the war without congressional approval. The following year, without American troops, the United States supported a South Vietnamese invasion of Laos. This too failed. In 1971, 800,000 tons of bombs were dropped by the United States on Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Opposition and the civil rights movement and protesting the war. As we go through this next section, think about what the similarities are between the civil rights movement and Vietnam. What issues are at play, and how do they align? Some of the first signs of opposition in the United States to the war came out of the civil rights movement, perhaps because the experience of Black people with the government led them to distrust any claim that it was fighting for freedom. On the very day that Lyndon Johnson was telling the nation, in early August 1964, about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and announcing the bombing of North Vietnam, Black and white activists were gathering near Philadelphia, Mississippi, at a memorial service for the 3 civil rights workers killed there that summer. One of the speakers pointed bitterly to Johnson's use of force in Asia, comparing it with the violence used against the Blacks in Mississippi. In mid-1965 in Mississippi, young Blacks who had just learned that a classmate of theirs was killed in Vietnam distributed a leaflet. No Mississippi Negroes should be fighting in Vietnam for the white man's freedom until all the Negro people are free in Mississippi. Negro boys should not honor the draft here in Mississippi. Mothers should encourage their sons not to go. No one has a right to ask us to risk our lives and kill other colored people in Santo Domingo and Vietnam so that the white American can get richer. One of the greatest sports figures of the nation, Muhammad Ali, the Black boxer and heavyweight champion, refused to serve in what he called a white man's war. Boxing authorities took away his title as champion. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out in 1967 at Riverside Church in New York City. "This madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and a brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours." Young men began to refuse to register for the draft, refused to be inducted if called. As early as May 1964, the slogan, "We won't go," was widely publicized. Some who had registered began publicly burning their draft cards to protest the war. Early in the war, there had been 2 separate incidents, barely noticed by most Americans. On November 2nd, 1965, in front of the Pentagon in Washington, as thousands of employees were streaming out of the building in the late afternoon, Norman Morrison, a 32-year-old pacifist, father of 3, stood below the 3rd-floor windows of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, doused himself with kerosene, and set himself afire, giving up his life in protest against the war. Also that year, in Detroit, an 82-year-old woman named Alice Hurst burned herself to death to make a statement against the horrors of Indochina. A remarkable change in sentiment took place. In early 1965, when the bombing of North Vietnam began, 100 people gathered at the Boston Common to voice their indignation. Perhaps 2 million people across the nation gathered that day in towns and villages that had never seen an anti-war meeting. By 1970, the Washington peace rallies were drawing hundreds of thousands of people. In 1971, 20,000 came to Washington to commit civil disobedience, trying to tie up Washington traffic to express their revulsion against the killings still going on in Vietnam. 14,000 of them were arrested, the largest mass arrests in American history. Middle-class and professional people unaccustomed to activism began to speak up. Corporations began to wonder whether the war was going to hurt their long-range business interests. The Wall Street Journal began criticizing the continuation of the war. As the war became more and more unpopular, people in or close to the government began to break out of the circle of assent. Students were heavily involved in the early protests against the war. Even in the high schools in the late 60s, there were 500 underground newspapers. The climax of protest came in the spring of 1970, when President Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia. At Kent State University in Ohio, on May 4th, when students gathered to demonstrate against the war, National Guardsmen fired into the crowd of students. 4 students were killed. 1 was paralyzed for life. Students at 400 colleges and universities went on strike in protest. It was the first general student strike in the history of the United States. During that school year of 1969 to 1970, the FBI listed 1,785 student demonstrations, including the occupation of 313 buildings. All this was part of a general change in the entire population of the country. In August of 1965, 61% of the population thought that the American involvement in Vietnam was not wrong. By May 1971, it was exactly reversed. 61% thought our involvement was wrong. Bruce Andrews, a Harvard student of public opinion, found that the people most opposed to the war were people over 50, blacks, and women. It seemed that the media, themselves controlled by higher education, higher income people who were more aggressive in foreign policy, tended to give the erroneous impression that working class people were super patriots for the war. Louis Lipsitz, in a mid-1968 survey of poor blacks and whites in the South, paraphrased an attitude he found typical. The only way to help the poor man is to get out of that war in Vietnam. These taxes, high taxes, it's going over yonder to kill people with, and I don't see no cause in it. The capacity for independent judgment among ordinary Americans is probably best shown by the swift development of anti-war feeling among American GIs, volunteers and draftees who came mostly from the lower income groups. There had been, earlier in American history, instances of soldiers' disaffection from the war, isolated mutinies in the Revolutionary War, refusal of re-enlistment in the midst of hostilities during the Mexican War, desertion and conscientious objection in World War I and World War II. But Vietnam produced opposition by soldiers and veterans on a scale and with a fervor never seen before. As the war went on, desertion from the armed forces mounted. Thousands went to Western Europe, France, Sweden, Holland. Most deserters crossed into Canada. Some estimates were 50,000, others 100,000. Some stayed in the United States. A few openly defied the military authorities by taking sanctuary in churches where, surrounded by anti-war friends and sympathizers, they waited for capture and court-martial. The dissidents spread to the war front itself. Wallace Terry, a Black American reporter for Time, taped conversations with hundreds of Black soldiers. He found bitterness against Army racism, disgust with the war, generally low morale. More and more cases of fragging were reported in Vietnam. Incidents where servicemen rolled fragmentation bombs under the tents of officers who were ordering them into combat, or against whom they had other grievances. The Pentagon reported 209 fraggings in Vietnam in 1970 alone. Veterans back from Vietnam formed a group called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And here as a side note, you can find all of the testimony that these veteran groups gathered online available for free if you Google Winter Soldier Investigation Vietnam Veterans Against the War. It's an amazing trove of primary source documents that will give you firsthand accounts of what American conduct in the war was like from the perspective of American soldiers themselves, who in these conversations were basically publicly admitting to war crimes. This is basically unheard of. Anyway, back to the text. In December 1970, hundreds of them went to Detroit to what was called the Winter Soldier Investigations to testify publicly about atrocities they had participated in or seen in Vietnam committed by Americans against the Vietnamese. In April 1971, more than 1,000 of them went to Washington, D.C. to demonstrate against the war. One by one, they went up to a wire fence around the Capitol, threw over the fence the medals they had won in Vietnam, and made brief statements about the war, sometimes emotionally, sometimes in icy, bitter calm. Most of the anti-war action came from ordinary GIs, and most of these came from lower income groups: white, black, Native American, Chinese, Chicano. Chicanos back home were demonstrating by the thousands against the war by this point. And soldiers protested too. Altogether, about 700,000 GIs had received less than honorable discharges. In the year 1973, 1 of every 5 discharges was less than honorable, indicating something less than dutiful obedience to the military. By 1971, 177 of every 1,000 American soldiers were listed as absent without leave, some of them 3 or 4 times. Deserters doubled from 47,000 in 1967 to 89,000 in 1971. One of those who stayed, fought, but then turned against the war was Ron Kovic. And if you've seen the film Born on the 4th of July, this is that guy. In 1963, at the age of 17, he enlisted in the Marines. And 2 years later, in Vietnam, at the age of 19, his spine was shattered by shell fire. Paralyzed from the waist down, he was put in a wheelchair. Back in the States, he observed the brutal treatment of wounded veterans in the veterans' hospitals, thought more and more about the war, and joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He went to demonstrations to speak against the war. One evening, he heard actor Donald Sutherland read from a post-World War I novel by Dalton Trumbo called Johnny Got His Gun, about a soldier whose limbs and face were shot away by gunfire, a thinking torso who invented a way of communicating with the outside world and beat out a message so powerful it could not be heard without trembling. Kovic demonstrated against the war and was arrested. In the fall of 1973, with no victory in sight and North Vietnamese troops entrenched in various parts of the South, the United States decided to make one final attempt to bludgeon the North Vietnamese into submission. It sent waves of B-52s over Hanoi and Haiphong, destroying homes and hospitals, killing unknown numbers of civilians. The attack did not work. The United States withdrew its forces, continuing to give aid to the Saigon government, but when the North Vietnamese launched attacks in early 1975 against the major cities in South Vietnam, the government collapsed. In late April 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon. The American embassy staff fled, along with many Vietnamese who feared communist rule, and the long war in Vietnam was over. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and both parts of Vietnam were unified as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Traditional history portrays the end of wars as coming from the initiatives of leaders, negotiations in Paris or Brussels, or Geneva, or Versailles, just as it often finds the coming of a war as a response to the demands of the people. The Vietnam War gave clear evidence that at least for that war, making one wonder about the others, the political leaders were the last to take steps to end the war. The people were far ahead. The president was always far behind. The Supreme Court silently turned away from cases challenging the constitutionality of the war, and Congress was years behind public opinion. It was only after the intervention in Cambodia ended, and only after the nationwide campus uproar over that invasion, that Congress passed a resolution declaring that American troops should not be sent into Cambodia without its approval. And it was not until late 1973, when American troops had finally been removed from Vietnam, that Congress passed a bill limiting the power of the president to make war without congressional consent. Even there, in that war powers resolution, the president could make war for 60 days on his own without a congressional declaration. The administration tried to persuade the American people that the war was ending because of its decision to negotiate a peace, not because it was losing the war, not because of the powerful anti-war movement in the United States. But the government's own secret memoranda all through the war testified to its sensitivity at each stage about public opinion in the United States and abroad. All of that data is in the Pentagon Papers. Again, declassified, publicly available, fantastic and really interesting reading if you're interested in this history. On April 2nd, 1965, a memo from CIA Director John McCone suggested that the bombing of North Vietnam be increased because it was not sufficiently severe to change North Vietnam's policy. Continued. On the other hand, We can expect increasing pressure to stop the bombing from various elements of the American public, from the press, the United Nations, and world opinion. The U.S. should try for a fast knockout before this opinion could build up, McCone said. Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton's memo of early 1966 suggested destruction of locks and dams to create mass starvation, because strikes at population targets would create counterproductive waves of revulsion abroad and at home. In May 1967, Pentagon historians write, McNaughton was also very deeply concerned about the breadth and intensity of public unrest and the dissatisfaction with the war, especially with the young people, the underprivileged, the intelligentsia, and the women. He warned, there may be a limit beyond which Americans and much of the world will not permit the United States to go. The picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week while trying to pound a tiny backwards nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one. It could conceivably produce a costly distortion in the American national consciousness. That costly distortion seems to have taken place by the spring of 1968, when, with the sudden and scary Tet Offensive, President Johnson was asked to send 200,000 more troops on top of the 525,000 already there. Johnson asked a small group of action officers to invite him on this. They studied the situation and concluded that sending troops would mean mobilizing reserves, increasing the military budget. There would be more U.S. casualties, more taxes, and, quote, this growing disaffection, accompanied as it certainly will be by increased defiance of the draft and growing unrest in the cities because of the belief that we are neglecting domestic problems, runs great risks of provoking a domestic crisis of unprecedented proportions. The growing unrest in the cities must have been a reference to the Black Uprising that had taken place in 1967 and showed the link, whether Blacks deliberately made it or not, between the war abroad and poverty at home. Evidence from the Pentagon Papers is clear that Johnson's decision in the spring of 1968 to slow down for the first time the escalation of war, to diminish the bombing, to go to the conference table, was influenced to a great extent by the actions Americans had taken in demonstrating their opposition to the war. In May 1973, American troops were leaving Vietnam. C.L. Schulzberger, the New York Times correspondent, a man close to the government, wrote, "The U.S. emerges as the big loser, and the history books must admit this. We lost the war in Mississippi Valley, not in the Mekong Valley. Successive American governments were never able to muster the necessary mass support at home. In fact, the United States had lost the war in both the Mekong Valley in Vietnam and the Mississippi Valley in the United States. It was the first clear defeat to the global American empire formed after World War II. It was administered by revolutionary peasants abroad and by an astonishing movement of protest at home." In conclusion, under what circumstances did the Truman Doctrine say the U.S. should intervene in other countries? Go through your notes and answer that question. Then think back to what we have learned about Vietnam. Did the case of Vietnam fit those circumstances? Why or why not? What specific actions, events, and aspects of the Vietnam War contradict the democratic ideals or founding principles of the United States? Think back to the Enlightenment, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and generally what this country says that it stands for. Also think, which groups were central to the protest movement? How did people protest the wars? And why did these protest movements work? Do you believe that protesting can still create real change in American government policy? Explain your reasoning. And what lessons can we learn from the Vietnam conflict generally that we can apply today?